everyone. Glad you're with us on this sunny Sunday morning. Rebecca Weaver, the ever popular Rebecca Weaver, is with us today and for 3 sessions to lead us in discussion on the Jewish Sect, the Gentile Church, and a question of continuity. I believe I got the topic right, didn't I, Rebecca? Is that right? I hope.
Yes.
I hope. Okay.
That's what I proposed. I'm not sure that's what I'm doing, but
very good. Well, exciting news today at the 10 o'clock worship service, folks. Wilson Kennedy will be ordained as a minister. So he's finished all of his work. Let's give Wilson a big round of applause. He's been working hard on it this summer, and he's finally achieved and we'll get his ordination today. So Wilson, congratulations, and we'll look forward to seeing that at the 10 o'clock service today. So congratulations. A bit of sad note for those of you who remember and knew Mike Livingston. I got word yesterday from Mary Kay Collins that he died. He was at Westminster Canterbury and contracted COVID. Then went to St. Mary's Hospital and spent, I think, a week or two there, I think, Wilson, and then ultimately passed away yesterday. So very, very sad news there. As most of y'all remember, Mike, we had to arrange to have him driven to the class. The Farnhams leaded that effort for some time, but many of you probably participated in driving Mike to the class. He always sat in the back corner of the room, but he was a loyal member and attendee of the Covenant class while he was able. So please keep his family in your thoughts and prayers. A few other announcements. The drive-through Advent gathering is today, this afternoon, from 1 to 3. So please come and join us. We are, Wilson, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we're looking for, if you have them, gently used or new coats, mainly for children, but adult sizes are also welcome. So if you have any of those, please bring them. Mary Kay next Sunday will be hosting a session on making space at 8 p.m. on Zoom. Let's make some space for God in the midst of busyness of the season. So look for more information on that. J-term is coming up in January. All of the classes are listed in your FP Seasons booklet on pages 11 and 12. You'll need to sign up for each of the classes to receive the Zoom link for each class, but more information will be coming out on that. Just wanted to give you a quick heads up there. Also, please remember those on the special concerns list from the church, those in the military, so keep them in your thoughts and prayers. And I didn't have any other announcements. Wilson, I think I covered everything. So with that, for all of you,
Drake, do we want to mention questions?
Oh yeah, I was just going to get to that.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I was just going to get that. Remember, for all of you, if you have questions, Rebecca loves to interact with the class and loves questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you, or type into the chat function of Zoom your question or the fact that you have a question, and we'll recognize you at any time during the class for you to ask a question of Rebecca, and she would really appreciate as many as you have. So Rebecca, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and we're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Drake. And not one word about Clemson. I do not understand.
Well, I thought you were going to lead us into Clemson cheer.
I can only do University of Texas. It is very good to be back with you. In however odd a form, I would say that we all need to be on our best behavior, because I see there are 3 Episcopalians and 1 Methodist here who are checking Presbyterians out for heresy. And we all need to be careful about that. I hope your lives have gone well during this past year. It's been difficult for everybody. Scott and I are very grateful to have remained healthy. We have had one life-changing event. Last July, we got a 2-month-old puppy, and we had always had cats. And I at least was a bit naive about what it would involve. But she's sweet, smart, adorable, and drives us crazy. But she has been a full-time distraction during this year of difficulties, and for that, we're grateful. She keeps us laughing. As Drake has just said, I typically start this class by encouraging you to raise questions or make comments. And we're going to try to do that with Zoom. I need those so that I can learn from you. But I also need them to see if I'm making sense. Sometimes communication is difficult, and so let me know if I don't make sense. Our work for these 3 Sundays, as Drake has indicated, is that we're going to consider the evolution of a first century sect within Judaism into a Gentile church. Mary D has expressed interest in that for the past couple of years, that it might be a good topic for the course or for this class. And so I decided to be brave and try to do it because, frankly, I don't know a great deal about the first century. But I've learned a lot. I'm going to rely heavily on 2 specialists, Paula Fredrickson and her book, When Christians Were Jews, and Craig Evans from Jesus to the Church. They don't agree on all sorts of things, but each of them is attempting to create a plausible reconstruction of those crucial decades from the crucifixion of 33 years, 30 or 33, somewhere in there, to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which is an enormously important event, both in Judaism and in Christianity. I say they're trying to create a plausible reconstruction because we really don't know much of anything about those years from 30 to 70. We know that during those decades, there was a small but growing number of Jews who became fiercely committed to the notion that Jesus, whom they believed to have been resurrected, was the Messiah that God had promised to Israel, not for the world, but God had promised Israel. These Jews were willing to die for their convictions. And some of them did, although we have no idea how many people were actually executed for their faith. Romans were crucifying people all the time. Anybody who seemed to be a rabble-rouser or an insurrectionist was subject to crucifixion. But it was the first generation in these years from 30 to 70, first generation of what I'm going to call the Jesus people. They did what was necessary to keep the memory of Jesus alive and vibrant. They wanted to make sure he was not forgotten. But they weren't thinking in terms of long term. They were thinking the end was coming soon. But this first generation, these were the people whom we depend on so much, because if their witness were untrue or it hadn't been there, then it had been forgotten, then we wouldn't have any church today. They were the ones who spread the news, and they did so in a way that was so convincing that they kept growing to their own surprise. Their numbers grew to include not only Jews, but also non-Jews, as their message about Jesus traveled throughout the Roman Empire, particularly in what was the Jewish diaspora. If you remember, in the second exile of the Jews, that they were taken to Babylon, excuse me, and when they were allowed to come home, a lot of them, I mean, it had been quite a few years, I think about 70 years, and they had no reason. They'd settled down, they'd married, they'd had children, they had businesses, they stayed, but they also had synagogues. So there were synagogues spread out around the Roman world. It was to these synagogues often that the news went about this Messiah. As a result of their witness of this first generation, this small group became a movement, a widespread movement, which became a religion, which was separate from Judaism. We don't know much about them. There is very little New Testament material on them. And there is a lot of scholarly argument about what any of it means anyway. Any questions so far? Now, one source of information that we do have are the letters of the Apostle Paul. There were a number of letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul, but there are only 7 that everybody agrees that he wrote. The 7 letters are First Thessalonians, First and Second Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, Galatians, and Romans. Now, there's certainly other letters that are attributed to Paul, but they were probably written either later or by people who were right around him. But even those 7 letters, it all happens within a short time. First Thessalonians was probably written at the end of the 40s or the beginning of the 50s. First Corinthians, probably written in the year 54. Paul has written a letter before that to the Corinthians, and he makes reference to it in what we call First Corinthians, but we don't have that first letter. Second Corinthians is probably a combination of 2 to 3 letters, and they were probably written in 55 or 56. Nobody knows when Philippians and Philemon were written. Philippians probably sometime in the 50s. Galatians probably in 55, and Romans, which is assumed to be the last letter, Romans is probably written in the winter of 55 or 56. Presumably, Paul wrote a lot of other letters that were lost. For whatever reason, they weren't saved. But what we know about Paul is that he was about the same age as Jesus. He was probably born within 2 or 3 years of when Jesus was born. He was an observant Jew, as was Jesus. He acknowledged having harassed the Jesus people. He even says he persecuted them. He was probably converted 2 to 3 years after the resurrection, and thus during the early to mid 30s. So, but Paul apparently knew absolutely nothing about Jesus until after the crucifixion. And then he began to hear about these Jesus people and set out to harass them. We don't know much about Paul's activities following his conversion. So from about the mid-30s until about 15 years later, 49 or 50, when he went to Jerusalem, we don't know what he did. Where did he learn his Christianity? Where did he learn about Jesus? And what did he learn from others? We don't know when he died. We don't know when he was executed. But these are our writings from the first generation. We really don't have anything else that I'm aware of from the first generation. And Paul had never known Jesus. He said that it's not clear. Paul and Acts, the Acts of the Apostles don't agree at all times. And it's not clear whether Paul had some kind of auditory event or some kind of visual event when he supposedly was on the road to Damascus to persecute more Christians. The Gospels were written by at least second generation, if not third generation Jesus people. So they're coming much later. They are all written after the fall of the temple in 70. And their focus is on the ministry of Jesus, and they aren't really concerned with the 4 decades between the crucifixion and or the resurrection and the fall of the temple. Mark was the first. It was probably written in the early 70s, probably in Rome. And it was written probably to converted Jews who had become dissociated from the synagogue or the temple. And it was also written to non-Jews. Matthew, probably written around the year 90 in Syria, perhaps Antioch. It was written clearly by a Jew to other Jews who had left the synagogue. Luke, probably in 80 to 90, maybe in Rome, maybe in Greece. The audience was probably not Jewish. And John was written in the 90s, maybe in Ephesus, but nobody really knows. It reflects the tension at that time. There's a lot in there about the tension between Jesus and his followers and Jews. Of course, Jesus and his followers were all Jews, but John presents them as Jesus and his followers versus the Jews, and often it's Pharisees. And that does reflect an emphasis at that time among Jews, especially Pharisees, to drive out these various sects. Now, the temple has been destroyed. The Jews have been sent out from Jerusalem, and they're trying to purify Judaism. And the Pharisees want to get rid of the Jesus people. Now, what we have in the New Testament about these 40 years is the book of Acts. It was written by the same person who wrote Luke, and we don't know who that was. And it is really volume 2 of the Gospel of Luke. They both start off being addressed to Theophilus. They have some of the same themes. And Luke if Luke were written in the 80s, 90s, then Acts would not have been written into the 90s or after the turn of the century. But it's our witness to the years from the ascension. That's where it starts, from the ascension till Paul is imprisoned in Rome. So probably in the early 60s. So Acts is the source we go to, and it does provide something of an outline of those early decades as the movement was spreading. But much of its attention is focused just on Paul, as he's the star missionary in this spread of the gospel. But in some significant ways, Paul's information that he gives about himself and the information that the writer of Acts gives about himself, gives about Paul, they don't agree. We need to remember Acts isn't a history book the way we often think of history books. It is like each of the Gospels, it has its own theological agenda. It presents itself as a historical account, but we shouldn't forget it was written very likely 70 years after, 70 years after the crucifixion, by somebody who'd heard about this. Now, there are non-Christian sources. Probably the most important one would be Flavius Josephus, a Jew who lived from about 37 to 100, but he'll really give us information about the Jewish War around 70, and then beyond that until his death in 100. Josephus was a Pharisee. He fought against Rome in the war, the Jewish war, and was captured and enslaved, and then later released and given a stipend. And he was able to write his own history, the Jewish war, and then the Jewish antiquities. Now, what I'm trying to indicate, and this has probably been a bit tedious, but what I'm trying to indicate are the few sources that are available to us and their limitations as they tell us about these centuries, these 40 years. We don't know very much. That was so crucial to development of a community and the spread of the gospel. But what we do know can be very disturbing. So what do we know? Well, let's start with terminology. Specifically 3 words: Christianity, Christian, and church. These are words we throw around all the time. They're basic to our vocabulary, but they are all anachronistic and they're badly misleading if we try to apply them to the first century. For example, the term Christianity is the name of a religion, as is the word Islam or Buddhism or Judaism. But in the first generation of what I'm calling the Jesus people, there was no religion of Christianity distinguishable from Judaism. Instead, there were Jews who came to hold certain convictions about Jesus. And these people became something of a party or a sect within Judaism. First century Judaism is something of an umbrella term under which a variety of parties or groups were sheltered. Judaism was not just one thing. It was not monolithic, just as Christianity is not monolithic and frankly never was. In Judaism, as we well know, there's Sadducees and Pharisees who were themselves divided, the Pharisees, into a whole bunch of different groups, depending on how they interpreted scripture. There were also the Essenes, a purity movement, and what I'm referring to as the Jesus people, because it's awkward to use the word Christian to refer to them. They don't think of themselves that way. And there were other groups. And initially, nobody paid much attention to the Jesus people. because there weren't many of them, and because they were just one more group of Jews. And I think what is most important for us to realize about this first generation of Jewish people, is that they did not understand themselves to be adherents of anything other than Judaism. Jesus' people thought of themselves as Jews, and everything they do or believe is colored by that fundamental reality. They are not trying to become something else. They're Jews. They're trying to be observant Jews. They believe Jesus has come to reform Judaism. That's what the focus is, Judaism. It appears that they remained observant Jews. They continued to worship on the Sabbath and even daily in the temple in Jerusalem. They continued to keep kosher. They continued to circumcise their male infants, and they continued to observe the Mosaic law. The law as God's good gift to Israel. They weren't trying to get rid of the law. We sometimes read Paul as if they were, but they weren't. What distinguished the Jesus people from other Jews were certain convictions they held. One was that Jesus was the Messiah who'd been promised to Israel. That makes him something of a Davidic figure or prophet. That involves absolutely nothing about being God, about being God. It really wasn't decided that Jesus, that the Son, whom, well, already I'm talking in language that doesn't apply, where we talk about the Son and the Father and the Spirit as a Trinity. There's none of that back here, none of it. We really developed the doctrine of the Trinity only in the 4th century. There is question, and we can talk about this later, but there's question about the Jews allowing for lesser deities, but they had one God. Their God was one. But it might put Jesus in the category of something of a lesser deity. Everybody's trying to work this out. They don't know. Of course, we're still working on it today. So they believed Jesus was the Messiah who's long promised to Israel. And they believed that he'd been raised from the dead. The really awful thing was for Jews was that he had been, was the way he died, anonymously on a tree. And Mosaic law emphasizes that anybody who dies on a tree is cursed by God. And so the cross is seen as a tree, and that's offensive. But they believed that he died in this way, but he'd been resurrected, so God had vindicated him. They also believed that Jesus was going to return very soon. Maybe not tomorrow, but certainly the day after. They were all waiting for a very fast, very quick return, and he would return in glory. Now, over the decades, these convictions were going to evolve. As Jesus, and the big problem is that Jesus doesn't return. And as his return is delayed for months, and then years, and then decades, and then a century and beyond, they're going to have to keep trying to reimagine how he could be the Messiah. What on earth does it mean if he isn't coming back? What function is he going to fulfill? What does it mean? but at least for the first generation, a Jew who held these convictions that he was the Messiah, he had been resurrected, and he would return soon in glory. A Jew who held these convictions was considered to be, and considered himself or herself, simply a member of a particular sect within Judaism. So let's look at the second confusing word, and that is church. The Hebrew, pardon me, let's look at the word Christian first. The Hebrew word Messiah, as you know, means anointed. Kings were anointed, sometimes prophets were anointed, but the Messiah was the anointed one, anointed by God. In Greek, the word for anointed is Christos, and so as the gospel spread outside Jerusalem and outside Palestine and moved into the diaspora, most of the Jews did not speak Hebrew or Aramaic anymore. They spoke Greek. And so if the gospel was then presented in Greek, and the word would have been Christos. The name is really a title, but it was used, it became fairly soon a proper name. Jesus Christ. It really is Jesus the Messiah or Jesus the Anointed One, but it becomes Jesus Christ, and that's the way we refer to him. According to Acts, Mary Smart is raising her hand. Or Marilyn Smart, pardon me.
Hey, Marilyn, unmute yourself. There you go. Marilyn.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Rebecca, thank you for coming. It's wonderful as always. My question is, the Jews expected a militant Messiah, someone who is going to conquer the Romans and give the Jews the power, the military power that they've been looking for years. And Jesus himself said to somebody that he would be returning quite soon, that the people alive at that time would see him again. With those two things alone, I'm amazed that anybody believed. What gave them this impetus to really become so devoted to the Jesus movement?
Thank you for, as usual, a very difficult question. No, I always appreciate it. I think they struggled with that, and a lot of them fell away. I think the resurrection was crucial. There seemed to have been resurrection appearances for quite a while. And Paul talks about he appeared to 500 people. But we don't really have much information about that. We have at the end of the Gospel of Mark, which is probably the first one written, there is no resurrection appearance. In Matthew and Luke and John, we have them, but there's the resurrection body is sometimes it can go through walls, and sometimes it seems quite solid, and Jesus eats. And he tells Thomas to touch the wounds in his side. And so, I mean, they were trying to describe something that can't be described, as was the author of Acts, talking about the ascension, where it's in the first chapter of Acts, where Jesus is carried up into the clouds. What on earth really happened? We don't know. But I do think that the resurrection was crucial for them. And these continued sightings, which eventually there were no more.
Do you think that the sightings, the post crucifixion sightings, are those interpreted even now? Are those interpreted as the second comings, so to speak?
No, I don't think so. I'm not aware of that. I'll put it that way. There are always some people who believe it's something, but no, they were waiting for Jesus to come in a cloud of glory.
Yeah.
But it was not the understanding had to evolve while they waited, and so the longer that they waited, the more warlike Jesus became. I mean, then you have in these the Gospels written after the fall of Jerusalem, you have Jesus talking about how this terrible destruction is going to come, and that Jesus will be coming in clouds of glory. Pity the mother who's nursing a child, or the woman who is in travail. Pity people if it comes in the winter or if it comes in the summer. It's going to be hard. Paul talks about in First Thessalonians, he talks, if I remember this correctly, he talks about his coming, and then all will be raised, and there's going to be a judgment. If that isn't in Paul, it's elsewhere. I mean, if it's not in First Thessalonians, it's elsewhere in Paul. But there, early on, I think there's an expectation that he is going to come, do something for Israel, but also there'll be a general resurrection. But they have them, and we'll go into this more next week, but that sense that Jesus coming back soon was absolutely crucial to them, but they had to keep understanding it. And I think part of what happens is the doctrine of the church evolves. And so this community that doesn't even really initially see itself as a church, an assembly, Paul begins to talk about it being a body. And we are all members of that body, and how if one of us rejoices, we all rejoice. And if one of us hurts, we all hurt. And I think that the church, as a community of people who just took care of each other, that became crucial. Robert Wilkin years ago wrote a book about how those early Christians were perceived, and many thought of them as many outsiders thought of them as a burial society. Romans had burial societies because it wasn't clear who was going to take care of your body once you died. And so you joined a group and, paid your dues. And of course, the group could become close and they could take care of each other. But there were these were people who would take care of your remains once you died. And the Romans, many of them thought that's what Christians were, another burial society, because they were very concerned about death and what happens after death. So I think there are a lot of dynamics going on besides just thinking Jesus is coming back day after tomorrow. And early on, they're going to be the witness of the apostles, and they're the teachings of Jesus, whom they find make more sense they find the way of Jesus the best way to live. It's a way of life. Even in this life, it is a way of life. Yes, ma'am.
Why would Jesus have actually told some of his followers that he would be back while in their lifetime?
Well, some would say he didn't say that's read back into it. I mean, remember, these were written late.
Yeah.
The Gospels were written by people who never met him. And they were written based on some that we no longer have access to, perhaps some written accounts. They had access to saying sources, that is the sayings of Jesus. They had access to the oral reports of the preaching of the apostles. So what Jesus actually said and what they understood to be the message of the risen Christ to the church through the work of the Holy Spirit, that allowed room for them to put such things in there, whether they actually believe that he said those words or not. I mean, you can do it that way, or you can go the route Albert Schweitzer went and just say he was wrong, and he was an apocalyptic figure, and he just got crunched under the wheel. He threw himself on the wheels of history and was crushed. I'm sure there are other ways to understand it, but I think some of it is a reading back into it. But I also think that Jesus may well have thought that he would be returning.
So Rebecca,
Yes.
all these writings, all these letters from Paul, every church would keep their letter in a special box because they knew it was something for permanence that they were going to keep for the committee later to decide on whether to keep or not keep.
You think?
I don't know.
Well, I don't know. He's often addressing problems in the church. And some of those people he talks to, he's not very nice. I mean, he says, "You stupid Galatians." Well, would you want to keep that letter? Would you want to make copies?
They were kept though, because we have them, right?
Well, yes, but it's hard to believe he wrote only 7. And I indicated earlier, there's some letter he wrote to the church in Corinth that has been lost because he makes reference to it in what we have as First Corinthians. So there's a pre-Corinthians. But what happened to it? Who knows? I mean, and of course, all these things have to be copied by hand.
Right.
So that's that.
This is your 5-minute warning.
Oh, okay. This always happens to me in this class that I think I don't have enough to say. And anyway, what we have though with that second very difficult word, Christian, is that the Jesus people didn't seem to use it for themselves. That was a name outsiders applied to them, and it's it's twice in Acts and once in First Peter, and it often seems to have a very negative connotation. And Jews who were who considered themselves also to be followers of Jesus, they continued to think of themselves as Jews. And Paul is the prime example of that. The final thing is the word church. And the difficulty with that is that the word in Greek, ekklesia, also means, or probably its first meaning is assembly. When you use the word church, you think of the institution, and the liturgy, the doctrine, the governance, the structure of governance, that in there. I mean, Paul in his own congregations, everything depended on the work of the Spirit. And if this week God gave you the gift of tongues, then you spoke in tongues, and someone else, God would give to someone else the gift of interpreting them, and God would give some the gift of preaching or teaching, but it could change. You know, the gifts come and go to one person and then to another. And so there's a lot of fluidity about it. And that won't work once you become an institution. Institutions have great difficulty with fluidity, as with the Holy Spirit, because it's kind of the flexibility factor in the institution. And we have to be careful that there isn't too much flexibility. So the Holy Spirit is always a threat. And it interests me that we don't talk about the Holy Spirit much in the Presbyterian Church. That might mean something. Anyway, but I think what we need to consider is that there were these assemblies would come together to pray, to sing, to hear the teaching of the apostles, and to share a meal. And they often assembled in people's houses, and that would have limited how many were to come. But I hope by looking at the vocabulary, we can see that we can think about our own experience as Christians who are adherents of a world religion, Christianity, that operates in various manifestations locally and globally. It's an institution. And think about our experience as opposed to their experience and the differences. I would like just to point out some things that I think all this detail has produced. The first thing is that first Christians were practicing Jews who regularly worshiped at the temple in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, in fact, was the spiritual center and the physical center of their religious self-understanding. And that in Jerusalem, what we come to call the Mother Church. And it was first led by Peter, and then it would be led by James, who is always described as the brother of the Lord. Now, that's something you may want to talk about next time, but James, the brother of the Lord, is said to have become the leader of that church. But the setting is Jerusalem. And that will pretty much remain the case until the temple is destroyed. Second, all of them believe that Jesus was the Messiah who was promised to Israel. The meaning of Messiah would evolve, but it meant some sort of Davidic figure, as Marilyn has said, a Davidic figure who would rescue Israel from its foes. And third, they all believed that they were at the end of time. Jesus would return soon. The delay in the return required that they keep reconsidering what a return would look like. And they would begin to go to the scriptures, the Old Testament, and reinterpret the Old Testament to help understand this delay, to help understand what really is meant by Messiah. So we'll find the scriptures used to explain who Jesus is, the Old Testament. Also to give him validity long after the first, second, third generations are dead. One other thing is, obviously, they didn't leave much material behind. They didn't write many documents, and those they wrote, they apparently didn't save that many of them because they didn't believe that they needed them for the long haul, because there was to be no long haul. Now, I think you and I may well want to ask ourselves whether the convictions, beliefs, practices that we encounter within this generation, this first generation, are recognizable today in the religion we call Christianity, in the institution that we know as the church, and among the people whom we know as Christians. And I think that's important to think of as we consider the significance of the temple in Jerusalem and the relationship between Christians and Jews today, of Jesus as the Messiah, the expectation of the end time. None of these things, from my perspective, figure prominently in the thinking of Presbyterians today. Are you waiting for Jesus to come before, you expect him to come before Christmas? I remember a fellow who taught Bible here, and he said when he was in seminary, the professor said, do you want Jesus to come tomorrow? And he said, oh yes, of course, he wanted Jesus to come tomorrow. And the professor said, well, think about it. Do you really want Jesus to come tomorrow? And he said, well, maybe not. I'm getting married at Christmas, and I like to get married first. Anyway, please come next week with your heretical Presbyterian notions about the second coming or the end time. We'll work on that.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That was really fascinating and some
Thanks,
really interesting
Rebecca.
things to think about.
Thank you
next week.
for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yes, and if anybody has any questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to email them to Mary D or myself this week, and we will get them to Rebecca, and she can perhaps field them next week. If that's okay with you, Rebecca.
Oh, sure. Oh, I like that very much.
I'm sure we didn't get maybe to a lot of questions. But please remember today to, if you can and are available, to come to the drive-through Advent gathering from 1 to 3 at the church. And be sure to tune in to the 10 o'clock service in just a few minutes, and where Wilson Kennedy will be ordained as minister. So congratulations once again to Wilson, and thank you everyone for attending, and hope you have a safe and healthy week, and look forward to seeing you this time, this same station next week. Same time. See ya.